The next section of the textbook discusses the energy demands of muscle fibers. When a muscle fiber is not contracting, it's squirreling up energy in the form of ATP, and some is used to generate creatine phosphate. So during contractions, each cross bridge breaks down ATP into ADP and a phosphate group, and so creatine phosphate is then used to recharge ATP. Then ATP must be generated in a different way. And so here's what the muscle fiber is doing when it's not contracting. Again, it's trying to gather as much ATP and store it in the form of creatine phosphate right here. And so they're going to be taking up glucose and storing it as glycogen. They're going to be taking fatty acids and combining using oxygen as a final electron acceptor to turn ADP into ATP. And they can use that then to make creatine phosphate as a kind of a bank or store, fast access store. One of the main ways that a cell generates ATP is aerobic metabolism. And as I was pointing to in the previous slide, that occurs in the mitochondria. So in order to make ATP with aerobic metabolism, you're going to be using ADP, using oxygen as a final electron acceptor and phosphate ions, and various other organic substrates from carbohydrates, lipids, or proteins, and you will be combining them through a series of chemical reactions called the citric acid cycle. Some of you may have learned it as the Krebs cycle, depending on who taught you biology. But basically what happens is you make ATP through the citric acid cycle inside of the mitochondria, and as a byproduct you also create water and carbon dioxide. So you're using oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide. It's one of the reasons we call this aerobic respiration. And so this aerobic respiration is dependent upon oxygen then in order to proceed. With aerobic metabolism, from one glucose molecule you can generate 34 ATPs. Again, that's dependent upon that steady supply of oxygen. If oxygen cannot diffuse into that muscle fiber fast enough, an alternative mechanism of ATP production has to be used. And so here we are showing what's happening in a muscle fiber under moderate activity. We're going to use our glycogen stores to pull off glucose molecules. Those glucose molecules we then break down into pyruvate, which is imported into the mitochondria, and it is run through the citric acid cycle. And in doing so, we break it down, release carbon dioxides, use oxygens, and we can make ATPs. So we add our ADP, you add a phosphate group to that, and you get ATP. Okay, so that's the main source in which we generate ATP. But again, what happens when you run out of oxygen or your oxygen supply is depleted? Then the cell has to switch to simply glycolysis, and glycolysis is that alternative for when you don't have a sufficient supply of oxygen to perform aerobic respiration. And in this process, glucose is broken down to pyruvate, and only 2 ATPs are generated. That pyruvate is then converted into lactic acid, which can be causing some problems in the cell in terms of pH. So here we have the muscle fiber at peak activity. Our glycogen is still going to be broken down. That's where we get our glucose from. That's our main source of energy. Glucose we turn into pyruvate, and we get 2 ATPs from that, but notice how there's no mitochondria involved anywhere in this picture. And so this pyruvate is turned into lactate or lactic acid, and we have to resort to using our creatine phosphates to keep up with the ATP demands at peak activity of that muscle fiber. And so muscle fatigue then is caused by the depletion of energy reserves or a lowering of pH, like if there's a buildup of that lactic acid, and the muscle will no longer contract as stimulated. And so that muscle has to enter a recovery period, which does require a repaying of the oxygen debt. This is typically achieved by breathing faster, so you can increase oxygen in the blood by breathing faster. And this occurs even after the end of exercise, and the recycling of lactic acid is happening. So the reactions that generate lactic acid, remember, are reversible. They can go in either direction. Now, heat is going to be produced during exercise, and that will raise the body temperature. So one of the things that your body does to compensate so that you don't overheat every time you are at peak exercise is the blood vessels in your skin are going to dilate, and the sweat that's covering the skin will evaporate faster, and so that will promote heat loss during that recovery period. Now, muscle performance can be considered in terms of force. Force, a little physics for you, is the maximum amount of tension produced by a particular muscle, in this case. And muscle performance can also be considered in terms of endurance, or the amount of time over which an individual can perform a particular activity. The two major factors that determine the performance capacities or capabilities of skeletal muscle are the types of muscle fibers within the muscle and the physical conditioning or the training of those muscle fibers. The majority of muscle fibers in the body are fast fibers, which are large in diameter. They have large glycogen reserves and very few mitochondria. So those fast fibers rely on glycolysis and are rapidly fatigued. They typically appear pale and are sometimes called white fibers. So those are the fast fibers. Slow fibers, the other bolded term there, slow fibers are about half the diameter of fast fibers, and they're slower, as their name would imply, but they're fatigue resistant. Okay, so those slow fibers are fatigue resistant because of three factors. Their oxygen supply is greater due to more perfusion. The myoglobulin stores oxygen in the fibers, which makes them appear very reddish. Sometimes they're called red muscles. And their oxygen use is very efficient because they have large numbers of mitochondria. And typically human muscles are a mixture of the fiber types fast and slow, white and red, and they will appear pink. So I also said that physical conditioning and training can increase power and endurance. And there's two different types of endurance: anaerobic endurance and aerobic endurance. In anaerobic endurance, this is when you have the length of time muscle contractions can be supported by glycolysis, so that anaerobic version of making ATP, and it's supported by any energy reserves of ATP and creatine phosphate. So this is going to be involved in this anaerobic endurance is increased by brief intense workouts that target the fast muscle fibers. Typically in anaerobic endurance athletes, you'll see hypertrophy or enlargement of the muscles. And aerobic endurance, the last one listed there, is when the length of a time of a muscle can continue to contract while supported by mitochondrial activities. So aerobic endurance is determined by the availability of carbohydrates and lipids or amino acids. So these kind of athletes are going to be carb loading in the days just prior to their event. These aerobic endurance is increased by sustained low levels of activity. So think slow pace, marathon type running or biking or swimming. That's aerobic endurance. So up to this point in the chapter, we've been focusing on skeletal muscle, and mainly because it makes up the bulk of all the muscle tissue in the body. But now we'll take a moment to consider cardiac and, on the next slide, smooth muscle tissues. Cardiac muscle tissue is found only in the heart and is composed of cardiac muscle cells, which are relatively small, with usually only one central nucleus. They appear striated and branched with intercalated discs, which connect cells to other cells. And these cells communicate through gap junctions in those intercalated discs, and they allow all the fibers to work together. 1% of the myocardium is composed of cardiac pacemaker cells, which uniquely exhibit automacity. So that means they can establish a rate of contraction without neural stimulation. Okay. The other 99% of the myocardium are just cardiac contractile cells, which can contract for 10 times longer than a skeletal muscle fiber. And that's because of their uniquely calcium-permeable sarcolemmas, which makes complete tetanus impossible. So these cells rely on aerobic metabolism, so they contain large numbers of mitochondria and abundant reserves of myoglobin, and they store oxygen like crazy. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, is found in the walls of most organs and in the form of sheets, bundles, or sheaths. Smooth muscle lacks myofibrils, sarcomeres, and striations. They're smaller than skeletal fibers. They're typically spindle-shaped and have just a single nucleus. Thick filaments are scattered throughout the sarcoplasm, and thin filaments are anchored to the sarcolemma. So we don't see that the sarcomere structure in smooth muscle cells. Instead, they're just scattered throughout the sarcoplasm or anchored to the sarcolemma. So what happens is when you have a contraction in smooth muscle, you get a twisting corkscrew-like motion. So these cells are bound together. When we looked at it in lab, the smooth muscles were teased apart so that you could see individual cells in that kind of sickle shape. Let's see, the nice thing about the cells being bound together, though, in the tissues is that the resulting forces can be transmitted throughout the tissue. So this is different from other muscle types because calcium ions from the extracellular fluid are needed to trigger a contraction mechanism. And that's different from other muscle tissues. These smooth muscles typically function involuntarily, so they are going to be responding to hormones in the extracellular fluid or pace setter cells. So we have a checkpoint question for you. Why do you think a sprinter experiences muscle fatigue before a marathon runner would?